As you can see and as you know from the program, we have a very special opportunity today to thank someone who's been a long-standing
Glad you're here.
standard bearer for jazz across our country and across our world and across the decades as well. So you'll hear more about that in a moment. But before anything else happens, I want to introduce the Dean of Academic Affairs, Dr. Lisa Holobaugh, who received her PhD in English. Our department is very glad and proud to say. And I'm also happy to say that as somebody who's been part of the Columbia Barnard family for many, many years, she's upheld the importance of the humanities in our midst, and particularly of the arts in our midst. Some of you know that at Columbia, every student is required to follow a core curriculum, and that we have the wonderful fact to brag about that jazz is part of our core curriculum. So every undergraduate of the college studies jazz. And so Lisa oversees that. Sorry? Oh, well, not all by myself. Thank you, though, Jerry. And so it's a pleasure to introduce Dean Holobaugh.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here to bring warm greetings from the college and to really thank you on behalf of the college for gathering today and for constructing such interesting dynamic conversations about the influence of the life and music of Louis Armstrong. I just wanted to build a little bit on what Bob was just referring to in our core curriculum. As a former music major myself, I'm particularly proud to be part of the college because it is one of the only liberal arts schools, it may be the only liberal arts school, that requires every one of our students to take, as a requirement for graduation, a course called Music Humanities. And most of our students enter this class without any formal musical training, and they can find it a little unsettling at first to be asked to put aside the texts that they're reading and think instead about the sounds that they're hearing. That's a different way of working for our students, to rely on their ears and to think about how not just to hear, but to listen. So in Music Humanities, they follow a history of music that goes all the way from medieval Gregorian chants to 21st century computer-assisted compositions. And around week 9 or 10, they move from Europe to New Orleans and to Harlem, and they discover jazz. And for many of our students, this is when this course really becomes personal. This is when they themselves start to recognize a form of music that influences the music that they are listening to today. This is when they feel a music that for many of them they find very immediate and present. And one of the best parts of this time in the semester is also when the members of the Columbia University Jazz Ensemble, who are all part of the Louis Armstrong Jazz Performance Program at Columbia, come into the classrooms, perform for the students, and talk with the students about what it means to play jazz. And so not only do the students get a chance to experience the excitement of hearing live jazz, but they also learn a lot about the ways in which communication is such a vital part of music. Communication between musicians and an audience. So as you might imagine, many of our students end up hooked on jazz for life. And so today's symposium is also an example of another really important form of communication in music, about music, as all of you narrate the continuing influence of Louis Armstrong, his life, his music, and I'm just so pleased and privileged to be here for even a portion of it. And if I could just say for a moment why I'm personally tickled to be here today with a personal story, which I think I shared with Bob once. A million years ago, when I started to date my now husband, he was introducing me to his friends, and he was kind of trying to prime them so they'd be predisposed to like me. And he had a friend who was a particularly phenomenal rock and blues guitarist. And he took this friend aside and he said, you know, Lisa plays music too. And his friend asked one question: can she jam? And my now husband said, well, she plays the cello, so no, I don't think so. To which his friend replied, then she can't play. And my now husband had the poor judgment to repeat this conversation to me, and I was rather heartbroken because I have, in fact, always longed to jam. And I just seem to be missing the jamming gene. But it makes it all the more a delight for me to be among people who jam so well in music, in writing, in conversation, and to hear on stage, even when there are no musical instruments present, the sweet, sweet sounds that you make. So thank you all so much for what you are doing. Thank you to Bob, to Jackie, to all your colleagues, to all of you here today, for ensuring that the talent and the virtuoso and the sublime person of Louis Armstrong remains for all of us, immediate and present. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your time at Columbia very much. Thank you.
You know, how lucky we are to have a dean of such warmth and eloquence. So thank you so much, Lisa. And what I want to do is say a word about our interviewer and about our interviewee, and then I'll step out of the way. But you should know that Dick Hyman will be interviewed by David Shevin, who is himself a bass player, who is well known on the jazz scene, and who is involved in many projects up and down the East Coast, most particularly. He's involved in something called Bassology at Elm City Market in New Haven. He plays most famously with the Afro-Semitic Experience, where you'll see him here and elsewhere on jazz circuits. For us today, the fact that he is a member of the Louis Armstrong Educational Foundation Board is most important. He's our one member who is a regular on the scene jazz player. So he keeps us all honest in that sense. Stanley too, but we are particularly happy to have David. So thank you for leading this session for us today. And he'll be talking more, as you'll see with Mr. Hyman. But it's my pleasure to tell you that we are delighted to be able to welcome the winner of this year's Satchmo Award, Mr. Dick Hyman. It's a great pleasure to have him here. He's a Columbia graduate as well, born in New York City, pianist and composer. He was named an NEA master, jazz master. He's a classically trained player who, through the years, has talked about his love for Chopin and Beethoven in particular. He's also a historian of the music as well as a player. And I'll say a word more about that in a moment, about his work as a teacher and historian. But I first met him through his record honoring Louis Armstrong. He has a terrific record called Louis Armstrong Remembered, where he brings together a band to take some of Armstrong's solos and score them for several trumpets. And so you hear Potato Head Blues ×4 with the work of Dick Hyman. It's always got that kind of energy and intensity that we heard about through the morning. His work as an historian has extended to work on Scott Joplin, Jelly Roll Morton, James P. Johnson, and then many others. Those of you who've seen the one clip of Charlie Parker on TV, where Parker is sort of signifying and playing, and then plays like crazy. He with Gillespie, Dick Hyman's on piano on that one appearance, and so he was part of that team of people creating a revolution in the music. He may be best known of late because of his work at the 92nd Street Y and for his Jazz in July series, which really prompts us as a foundation board to recognize his work as a jazz educator, where day after day and then summer after summer, he was educating audiences with first-class bands on the history of this music. They would get on stage with dark glasses and do the bebop thing. They would play New Orleans music and swing it off the hook. And it was always Dick, though, who guided all of that and who made it have a sense of conscientiousness and focus. He's also very well known now, and I might say, too, that Columbia's own Jerome Chazen is behind the Jazz in July, and we're very delighted to have him as a representative of both those institutions. So thank you so much, Jerry. Everybody in this room has seen films by Woody Allen, and half of the people in the room know that when the music comes up and when there's incidental music and when there's this and when there's that, it's Dick Hyman, who's been the musical director. He was the pianist, arranger, conductor, advisor for those films, one after the other. So the tremendous capacity to bring those moving pictures into music is really due to the genius of that man sitting there. The other thing I want to say finally is I was going through my records, and there he is on organ, killing it with Paul Gonsalves. There he is on piano, and record after record after record. There he is as the arranger, conductor of so many pieces across one's record collection. And so aside from honoring him as somebody who's a great teacher, just as a kind of living embodiment of the jazz spirit, we honor him. He's somebody who has the qualities that we talked about this morning in Armstrong, the kind of generosity, the virtuosity beyond mere capacity to play with technical skill on toward true virtue in himself that radiates forward. And so help me welcome these two gentlemen and get them started. David Shiven, Dick Hyman.
All right. Thank you, Bob. You stole all my thunder.
Thank you, too.
I was gonna wax poetically about the Hot House TV performance that Dick played on with Charlie Parker, but I am still gonna say a few things because in my hat as a jazz educator, my students every year are compelled to watch you play with Charlie Parker. Compelled.
That was a memorable time. You know, it was a nightly program on what was in those days called the Dumont Television Network. We had a nightly program which usually attracted film stars and singers and celebrities from films. And at that point, Leonard Feather appeared in order to give an award to Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. And the house band consisted of myself and a bass player. And we added a drummer for the occasion, Charlie Smith. And that's how the whole thing happened. It was a very modest thing, and the fact that it turned out to be the only time that Charlie Parker was seen on television actually playing is a memorable occasion.
Indeed. So you and I had a really sparkling phone conversation the other day, and before we get into the material from that, I want to take you in a completely different direction. This year, you are the recipient of the Satchmo Award, which is an award that the Louis Armstrong Educational Foundation has been giving out for close to a decade to people who are educators in the spirit of Louis Armstrong and who aren't educators perhaps in a conventional sense, but nevertheless, through the work they've done, have imparted some aspect of Louis Armstrong's spirit and love of kids and love of education to others. So in that spirit, I wondered if, beyond, say, your work for the Armstrong album that you did, if you could talk a little bit about Louis Armstrong and how he was an influence on you in your own work.
Well, when I was very young, my big brother, who was 6 years older, introduced me to early jazz. I shouldn't like to be misunderstood here. I am an old guy. I am 92. But in 1927, when I was born, there were an enormous number of marvelous recordings made, a good many of them by Louis Armstrong, who had begun recording maybe 5 years earlier with King Oliver's band. But in 27 and 28, he was in charge of his own sessions, and he made some of the classics which we're still admiring today. And I saw something only last week on the occasion of the moon landing, and something I saw on television. At that time, they played an Armstrong record from the 1927, and it fit perfectly. There's something about his playing which was so, at the same time, how shall we say it, I face a room full of people who are more expert than I in the language, but it was a combination of nobility and modesty and just excessive invention and a heroic manner. And there was Louis playing as we saw shots of the moon and the earth in the background, and it was all of a piece. It was really the heroism of all the participants was perfectly expressed by the way he played.
So as a player, did he have any kind of influence on you?
Well, of course he had an influence on me. I've learned all of those records, and years ago I can play them in my head anytime I'm prompted, and often when I'm not. I know those records by heart. Every note, every sideman's part of the performance. And he exemplified not only the progress of jazz, but a number of other aspects of it, which I'm sure we're going to touch on.
Do you want to touch on any of them right now? Because I was going to move in a different direction, but
Go ahead. You lead it.
all right. Well, so as we've already mentioned a couple times, we're honoring you for the work you've done educating others. Who were some of the educators who influenced you, and could you talk about how your teachers have influenced you as both a performer and as someone who imparts musical ideas to others?
Well, when I was growing up, I was lucky enough to have as a teacher, once I got a certain amount of dexterity, an uncle whose name was Anton Rovinsky. The old family name was Rovinsky. And he became my teacher, and he gave me some very careful and very valuable insights into how to play the piano. Anton was a recitalist who first played in various places in New York in the 1920s. And I was lucky enough to still be able to have him act as my teacher much later on. It was him, and it was my big brother, whom I've mentioned earlier, who really introduced me to things of value, and for which I'm still grateful.
And was he the one who introduced you to jazz, or did
No,
you?
that was my brother. At that time, old records of the 20s were beginning to be reissued, often on small, almost private labels. The big companies didn't begin to get in on reissuing their own property for a couple of years more. George Avakian was one of the important people who led Columbia Records to reissue some of their own masters. But there were clubs, United Hot Clubs of America, UHCA was one of them, and a number of others. And we got all those, and I still have all of those old 78 records. They're very inconvenient to play these days.
Yep.
You have to get up and turn the record over or change the stylus or something every 3 minutes or so. We're much better off today.
We are. I know I sometimes demonstrate that to students. I'll play in a 78, and as cool as it is, you know, you can fit a lot more songs on this than
Oh, yeah.
on a 78. So would you consider yourself, as much as you were a trained pianist, would you consider yourself self-taught as a jazz musician, or did you actually work with other people to grow your craft?
My brother showed me a lot of things about jazz playing, and he dropped out as a player, though. And one of the great adjustments, I guess, for both of us was to acknowledge that I was the better player, even though I was the kid brother. But he certainly taught me the valuable insights into the whole thing. For the rest, I suppose I'm self-taught with a good ear and a good capacity for memorizing these old records.
Right. So did you use that for your arranging, or did you actually have an arranging teacher?
No, the arranging came bit by bit. Just making notations so that all of us kids would be doing roughly the same thing when we all met and played together. The arranging developed out of that, and it developed out of piano playing. And one thing arrangers have to do after a time, if they began as piano players, which most of us did, is you have to transcend the piano. You have to learn what an orchestra sounds like and comfortably plays like. So that's one of the things. It just develops, but you have to keep working at it. I'm still working at it.
Sure. But are you using a computer these days, or do you still do it by hand?
Oh, no, I do it by hand.
Nice.
I have a very good copyist or two, and no. The other aspect of this is that I personally work best with a pencil and a long eraser and some soft paper, and a good deal of it is trial and error, or capturing a moment's idea and then maybe working out a little bit.
Great. Now, as you remember the other day, you and I had a really interesting phone conversation about the whole idea of being a jazz educator. And initially, you were reticent to see yourself that way.
Yeah. Well, I've been thinking about our conversation, and it was very interesting. I think you were pressing me to acknowledge that I was a jazz educator, and I was pointing out that I'd never really considered myself such, but in the way of perhaps being an example to other people, of course. Anybody who is practicing the technique is an example. In that case, I guess I have been an educator.
Mm-hmm. So let's sort of dig into that, because that's the whole reason you're here today, is to really talk about jazz and education. And I remember when we talked the other day, I pointed out that one of the people that I think of as one of the great jazz educators, outside of yourself, of course, was the late Clark Terry, who taught as much as you do by example. And I wondered if you could comment on that.
I knew Clark. I was fortunate enough to to perform with him a fair number of times on different recordings, different jazz festivals. And he was a remarkable guy. He was an example, I think, of what you're talking about. But more than me, he went out of his way, I think, to guide individual players, individual students. Besides being an example, he was specifically a teacher. And I've done much less of that than he did.
Well, I looked you up. You've done a lot of workshops.
Well, I've done workshops.
And the Jazz in July program, I mean, that's practically University of Jazz.
I guess you might say that. But in our case, it was really putting on a good show, an appealing show and an honest show, and involving other musicians who had the same spirit. My friend Ken Poplawski is one of them, and Bucky Pizzarelli, and other people whom I knew at least as much from the recording studios in New York as from working out on the road. I didn't do a great deal of road work. I was very fortunate enough to have a career that coincided with a boom in recording in New York. So for all that time, I was available and I played anything that was put in front of me. And I learned from every occasion.
So let's talk about Jazz in July.
Okay.
How did that all start?
Well, the people in the 92nd Street Y had an excellent idea and some available time, which turned out to be the first couple of weeks in July, and they had the space, and I had the time, and we just put together something as representative and honest about our playing as we could.
Mm-hmm. And yet, everyone I've spoken to who's followed it for all the years that it was gone thought of it as an educational experience.
I guess so. I don't want us to get hung up on just what is educational, but if I've been educational, it's more by example than in performance and maybe in assembling certain productions than it is in deliberately setting out to deal with individual young people. That is what Clark did, Clark Terry.
And you? I know you're being very humble here.
Well, often I would be asked to play for some students, for example, in the University of New Orleans a few years ago, and sort of explain what it was I was doing, and I guess that is teaching. And it was an audience of students. Some of those things are up on television now. You can see them. They're great fun to watch.
I have, which is why I really look at you as an educator, because everything I've seen really knocks me out.
I accept the accolade. Thank you.
Please do. Please do. Give him some love, please.
Thank you.
So, I'm not really sure where I'm going to go because I've used up most of my questions because you've been so careful about positioning yourself. I know that you've taken very few private students. Have you taken any?
No, other than some friends. Some young friends have come over and still do. And I see them and I kind of give them what advices I can render.
Because oddly enough, that's actually what jazz education, in my mind, so often is. I read the books like Robin Kelly's book about Thelonious Monk, and someone would just go over to Monk's house, and they'd have a meal, and he'd show them a thing or two, and often those players talk about those experiences for decades beyond that one afternoon or evening.
Yeah. Well, I admit, I get something out of those contacts and those meetings too. It's very self-educational to be able to explain exactly what it is you've been doing, and it is enlightening because sometimes, if you're playing an improvisational thing such as we do, you haven't quite defined what it is you're up to. And the process of defining and explaining it, I guess, is education. And it makes it clearer to me what it is I've been doing. And it makes it more sensible to begin to transcribe and write down and convert your improvisations into some sort of composition, which is what I've been up to more recently.
So do you think your classical training helped prepare you for some of that, or?
Oh, yeah. Sure. And if you can master a few Beethoven sonatas, you see what a real composer and a real improviser can do with the materials. Beethoven was just such. You know, he was an improviser. Some of his earliest programs were that he would go on stage and essentially do a jazz performance. He would improvise on something, on a well-known piece, or on somebody else's playing, or on anything that anybody suggested. It was a kind of, for its day, a kind of a jazz.
Mm-hmm. Let's open it up. Does anyone have any questions for Dick?
Yes, sir.
Can you tell us about your CD-ROM series?
Say that again, please.
Can you tell us about your CD-ROM series?
Your CD-ROM series.
You'll have to tell me, what is the CD-ROM series?
Your 100 Years of Jazz.
Tell me more. I mean,
He wants you to elaborate.
It was a video series that you worked on some years back, and it involved kind of overview of what is usually referred to as the jazz tradition.
well, I can't talk about those things in detail, but that generally is the sort of what we've been getting into. There is a history to this sort of thing, and we've all fallen into it. And it's been more appreciated in recent years and more notated what we're involved in than it was. And there goes my phone. Somebody else is criticizing me.
We have a question from Antoinette, right? No? Yes.
Oh, Carrie, she was a great friend.
Department tour for the Louis Armstrong tribute.
Well,
was done with
Carrie
you, right?
was in the band when we took the Louis Armstrong, the arrangements which were mentioned earlier of Armstrong, which I did for 3 trumpets and an accompanying band. And we, with Carrie singing, we went to Russia, that is the Soviet Union, way back. And we played more of that tour in other places in Europe. And I played with Carrie an awful lot other than that. She was a great friend and a wonderful singer. I'm very glad we were able to connect at that point.
Oh, I see.
Yes.
How did you come in contact with Woody Allen, and what was that experience like?
How did I come in contact with Woody Allen? Yeah. I think my first contact with Woody Allen was in some general record session where we were recording the music for, and I think it was Mundell Lowe who had a band for one of the early Woody features. And I think that's the first time I played for Woody. And it just developed that way. I was available. I was in New York, and Woody's inspiration would strike at odd times, and I was living in New York or nearby, and I was able to answer the bell whenever his office called. So it just developed from there.
We have a hand in the back.
How did you assemble your repertoire? Seems to me that over your long productive life, you've got
How
an
did I
enormous
assemble
repertoire.
Well, there were a couple of sources for that. One of them was a club date booker whose office still may be active in New York, Lester Lannon. Lester Lannon booked combos and occasionally somewhat bigger orchestras for affairs where the modus operandi was that the person in charge would call out a tune we were about to fake. Even with a big orchestra, everybody knew what to do. And we would run through the list of songs by Gershwin, Porter, Rogers, and Arlen, and all the rest. And people would dance to it at various parties or affairs, often in Long Island. And that was one very crucial source of the repertoire. You had to know the tunes. That's an old expression in the music business. If somebody is recommended to another booker, the second booker says suspiciously, "But does he know the tunes?" And you get to know the tunes by doing that kind of job. And if there was a tune that you didn't know, you listened carefully to the band playing the first chorus, and then you got the idea, and you were into it. And also, there was quite a bit of silent exchange between the pianist and the bass player as to which way we were going. Anyhow, you learn tunes from that source, and I learned a different sort of tune from the records that I described before that my big brother provided me with. And then just generally, one becomes interested in tunes, and you learn tunes also as a pianist from the singers for whom you accompany. I learned a lot of tunes from Sandy Stewart, who is Bill Charlotte's mother. And I heard them both last night, by the way. And I learned the songs that she asked me to accompany her on, and dozens of other singers. So that's how you learn songs. You just have to be there, and you have to be put in a position of necessity of learning them. There's no magic about it.
Did you ever make a list or have a database or what key things are in it, or is it just all what you took in your head?
I have a list of many performances, and I have lists and lists of lists. And these days, the question is not exactly learning new things, it's remembering the old things that I used to know. So I go over those lists, or the old lists of performances that I did, and make sure that I still know how to play those things, because that's when you begin to get old, that's the thing that begins to go. You have to keep on relearning.
Thank you.
Ricky?
Do you have any stories from working with Slim Gaillard?
Ha.
Well, do we all know who Slim and Slam were? McVouty and O'Rooney. I did record a little bit, maybe one or two sessions with Slim Gaillard, who was a very funny guy. Again, you can find him easily on the web. But Slam, I knew slightly differently. Slam was an excellent player, besides fitting into the comedy routine of Slim and Slam. And there was one other very important source of learning when I was coming up, and that was what were called in those days jazz parties. Jazz parties began with a man named Dick Gibson, who put on weekends of performances by many, many players, perhaps as many as 50 different players, whom he would divide into reasonable combos and orchestras, and put us to work on a schedule which began Friday nights and went through Sunday afternoons. And the marvelous thing about that was that one would get to play with people whom I had only encountered previous to that on recordings. So Slam was one of the bass players who was in that pool of people I was one of the piano players, and often we got to play together. That's how I first played with, well, perhaps not the first time, but with Clark Terry. The personnel for these parties came largely from New York, but partly from California as well. And we did such parties for Gibson in Denver, and then we did more of them in Texas, and in each of them there was an example. There was plenty of information to be learning and plenty of friendships to be made. Yes, sir.
You're well known for recording with Arbor's Records.
Yeah.
And you're culminating that with a performance of Lerner and Lowe. That's the most recent one, but my question is if you would start with meeting Matt Dauber and your association with Arbor's Records and some of the ways that you created those wonderful CDs and albums that you made. And then, of course, there's the parties that he organized in which you were a participant.
Yeah, well, thank you. Matt Dauber did, in fact, found Arbor's Records. And when Matt passed on a few years ago, his wife, Rachel, assumed the leadership of that company. And early on, they asked me to record, and some of my most, to my mind, most accomplished work has been on albums I did for them. Up until recent times, in fact. Again, how did I meet Matt Dauber and Rachel Dauber? It's hard to say the very first time, but we were all in the mix. We all liked the music. We all liked getting together. And there were these occasions, from recording sessions to jazz parties to just chance meetings. And after a while, you get to know people, at least if you're lucky.
Bob?
It hasn't come out yet that you've often worked with dancers. You've worked with Twyla Tharp and with other contemporary dancers, as well as for dances. And I wonder if you can say a word about that.
Well, I was fortunate enough to work with a couple of, with some dance people. Twyla Tharp was one of them. And Twyla fashioned some of her dances to certain specific jazz records. And when it came to performing them, she would ask me if I could put together a band which could actually do those things. So we did the Jelly Roll Morton pieces and one or two others. And I also did stuff for the Cleveland Ballet, and for them I wrote some original music. And the Cleveland Ballet then moved west to Los Angeles. Those are the two major dance companies. More recently, Twyla was set on reviving that dance I mentioned to, I think she called it 5 Jelly Rolls, or a name, something like that. She wanted to perform it again on Broadway, and she did. I couldn't do it this time. And she ended up playing the recordings, which was okay. Of course, it was perfectly valid music making, but it wasn't live. We didn't do it live, and I was sorry I couldn't get to do that with her this time.
Alan?
I know that in the days of the 92nd Street Y, one of the things that people always look forward to is your recitals with George Shearing. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about playing with George and then also playing 2 piano sessions from time to time.
George Shearing was one of my favorite players and musicians, and I looked up to him, and I learned all I could from him. And he did, in fact, perform several times with me at the 92nd Street Y for the series which we've been discussing. We did it in a very odd formation. We set up the two pianos on stage so that our backs were to the audience, and so that mine was farther back, that is, farther toward the audience than his, so that I could see what he was doing. And also, at the same time, we had the cameras set up so that the keyboards were displayed on a screen, side by side. And I watched George very carefully and learned even more about his playing and learned to appreciate him more in those sessions than otherwise. George was a wonderful player and a very, very decent guy, and he was an example to me in many ways in playing the piano.
Question right here.
Yes, ma'am.
I know you have considerable skill as a stride pianist. Was that part of the influence of your classical training, or you just learned to do it because you do it so well?
Well, thank you. Stride piano was, with my interest in jazz from a generation or so earlier than my actual chronological age, I came to admire people like James B. Johnson, Jelly Roll, although he didn't exactly play stride, and Art Tatum, who, when he wished to, could could outstride anybody, and it was just part of the education. It was again something I owed to my very early collecting old jazz records. Stride piano was something that has become less played now. There are a few of us still, and I hold on to it. I love to do that, and I still find a great deal to admire and to emulate in recordings of James P., Fats Waller, Tatum, half dozen others.
Well, I have another question, and then
Please.
Bob. So I had, once I heard Slim Gaillard, I was reminded that one of my favorite albums when I was a student was the album that you recorded with Slam and Major Holly, and I just wondered, did you have a hand in the arrangements? That was an interesting album. I just have to say, having two bass players like that.
Yeah, well, I was friendly with both guys, and I was playing with them in other circumstances. And I think that, I think it was Major Holly who put that thing together, and they asked me to do it. And there was no arranging. We just got together and we did what came naturally. And things like that you don't, with three guys of whom I'm very proud to be a part, you don't really need arrangements. You just need to decide what tune we're playing or how it's going to go or what the sequence is or so forth, and then you do it.
Mm. Well, I'm really glad you did that one. That gets played a lot even to this day, especially
Really?
the "Shut Your Mouth." That is very
Shut
funny.
Your Mouth.
Yeah. Well, not just the two. What is that? A takeoff on "Close Your Eyes"? No, "Tomorrow." That's the one. They did "Tomorrow," and that was.
Oh, is that what it was?
Yeah, I'm sure I remember it better than you.
I think
you've
you do.
recorded a lot of stuff.
Well, I don't always remember my own things too well,
Sure.
but I'm glad you do.
Well, probably because I'm a Slam fan. I saw a question from Bob.
Oh, you've made a big point about teaching by example, and I'm sure the people in this room have learned a lot in the last 40 minutes from just listening to you. You've taught so much by example, and also you've talked about the people who are exemplary for you and what you've learned from them, songwriters and other examples, teachers formally, and other practitioners of the music. As we come back to Armstrong, I was very taken by your talking about the use of an early Armstrong recording.
It's something I just saw a week or two ago, and it had to do with old video footage of the moon landing. And at that time, somebody had the brilliant idea of playing an old Louis record, and it worked so well.
The words you used were, if I'm remembering correctly, that you found a nobility and a modesty in the playing that you admired, a heroic quality. Can you say another word about what you learned from Armstrong by example?
Oh, now Armstrong, heroic is a good word. His playing was heroic and unique. And how else shall we put it?
It's on you.
Okay.
Joyous.
Joyous, all of those things. The interesting thing about Armstrong, one of the many interesting things, is that you can't quite pinpoint him. You can't say, well, this is the best Armstrong. No, in every era, his style, which became a little less flamboyant and more to the point as time went by. When he was a youngster, he was kind of all over the place, and later he refined it and began to pinpoint certain aspects of it. He was greater than jazz chronology. He was greater, really, than the development of jazz. And in this respect, it was always Louis when he played, and it was always perfectly right, no matter whether he was playing a Latin kind of a thing, or a novelty piece, or something halfway funny and halfway serious like Mac the Knife. Whatever, he wasn't, let me put it this way. He didn't necessarily go along with what the times called for. He was always himself. He was always Louis, and he was, no matter what the music called for, whether he was playing a hymn or America the Beautiful or some trite pop song, it was always the right thing to do as he played it. I don't have the words to go in. Perhaps you can help me.
No, I think you've summarized it very well. Do we have any more questions before we? Okay, in the back.
Mr. Hyman, I heard a story once that a late friend of mine told me, and I want you to tell me if it's true or apocryphal. I was told that you were in conversation with Roy Eldridge one time, and that you said to Roy Eldridge that you came to realize that what Charlie Parker was doing, in part, was playing Louis Armstrong twice as fast. And Roy Eldridge reportedly said to you, "You just realizing that now, baby?" Now, I'm just repeating the story as it was told to me. Is there any truth to that at all?
Well, I'll tell you the honest truth. I don't remember.
Okay. Thank you for being honest.
It sounds as though it well might have happened, and Roy did wise me up on a number of things like that. I loved playing with Roy when it was possible to do that way back, and we miss him still.
Our conversation has really ranged from performances and education and Charlie Parker, and especially Louis Armstrong. And I want to remind all of you and invite those of you who haven't gone to Eventbrite already that this Friday at the Alhambra Ballroom, for exactly the cost of $0, you are all welcome to celebrate as we honor Dick as the recipient this year of the Satchmo Award for Education, Jazz Education. And let's please give a big round of applause for Dick Hyman.